Welcome, everybody, to this afternoon's webinar on navigating lobster tariffs. We certainly are in some uncertain uh, uncertain times at the moment, and so we'll get going here in a second. Thank you for taking time to join us this afternoon. Um, I'm Nick Batista. I'm Chief Policy and External Affairs Officer at the Island Institute. I'm really excited for today's panel. Looking forward to learning a lot more. In the Island Institute, we work with island and coastal communities, and we do a lot of work at the local level. And so thinking about international trade and what's going across the border with Canada and all of those implications, it's not some place we spend a lot of time as an organization. And so really grateful for our panelists here today to help us understand a little bit about what's happening, a little bit about the context and what some of the trade discussions mean for Maine and for the lobster industry off our coast, lobster industry that supports our communities. All right, I think go to the next slide. All right, so this is a Zoom webinar. Many of you may have been on one of our Zoom webinars before. If you haven't, or if you need a refresher, it's a webinar format, so you can't see everybody who's on the webinar, but you're all here, you're all watching and seeing the panelists. If you have a question, you can use the Q&A button down at the bottom of the Zoom screen. And if there's a little bit of directions there, if you're having trouble hearing us, and if you have questions, don't hesitate to reach out in the chat. We have a couple of Island Institute staff standing by to provide tech support and help you out. And we're also, just a reminder, we're recording this webinar, and so it'll be available after if you have to drop off, or for those of you who are unable to make it today. So, Island Institute, we boldly navigate climate and economic change with island and coastal communities to expand opportunities and deliver solutions. We're located in Rockland, Maine, and when it comes to issues around the lobster industry and how the industry supports Maine coastal communities, Maine's island communities, it's something that we care deeply about as an organization. And so, as I said earlier, we're glad to be here today with you, and glad for our panelists to be here. So we'll do a quick introduction of the panelists. We'll hear first from Amanda Rector, who's the Maine State economist. And then we'll hear from Eric Miller, who's the president of the Rideau Potomac Strategy Group, works on international trade and tariff issues, particularly with the US and Canada. And then we'll hear from Luke Holden, who's the founder and CEO of Luke's Lobster and former Island Institute board member and close partner across a lot of our work. So we'll get right in here, I think. So, all right, Amanda, we're going to turn it over to you for some of the basics. Canada's our neighbor. What do we do? How does this work?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for having me this afternoon. I am going to start out with some real basics just to make sure we're all sort of on the same playing field here. And I just want to start by saying, so what is this cross-border trade thing? And why do we even care about it? So if you think about any given place, it might be a state, it might be a country, no place can supply all of the goods for its own residents that the global economy could provide. We just don't have all the stuff. So trade is how we make up for that. We have some stuff that you want, you have some stuff that we want, we trade back and forth. Maybe we're better at making something than you are, maybe you're better at making something than we are. We have this globally integrated economy. So materials and products go back and forth, both across domestic borders, so Maine and New Hampshire, but also across international borders, Maine and Canada and other borders as well, throughout the manufacturing process or other processes. It's not just limited to manufacturing, although that's sort of how we primarily think about it. So maybe there are parts that go back and forth. Maybe it's some product that is raw that gets processed and sent back. They go back and forth multiple times. It's not necessarily a one and done kind of thing, although that can happen too. So what's important about this is that it both opens up new markets for producers and provides new products for consumers. So there are benefits to this on both sides of the equation. International trade, cross-border trade across international borders, is regulated through a whole variety of policies, and that includes tariffs, which we'll hear a lot more about later on. Let's go to the next slide. This is sort of really big picture. So for Maine, we import some stuff and we export some stuff internationally. This is specifically looking at international trade now. Sometimes we import a little bit more than we export. Sometimes we import a lot more than we export. More recently, we've seen that import line really increase, particularly during the pandemic. We saw the US dollar strengthen during that time. That made imports cheaper and more attractive. So when the dollar is strong, we tend to import more stuff. So when that gap opens up and you see a lot more imports than exports, that's what's called a trade deficit. If we were exporting more stuff than we were importing, we'd have a trade surplus. But generally speaking, for Maine here, we have this trade deficit. It's been a little bit larger recently than it had been earlier from, if you look at earlier in this chart here around 2010 through to about 2020, that decade, the gap was pretty small. We can go to the next slide. So where do we trade with? I mentioned Canada. So in 2024, Maine exported stuff to 168 countries and territories, so all over the place. But Canada's first, and Canada is first by a lot, like an entire order of magnitude. So we send stuff all over the place, but mostly it goes to Canada, which makes sense. If you look at the map, they're right there. So if we go to the next slide, this is the flip side of it now. Where do we import stuff from? Well, we imported stuff from 128 countries and territories. So we import from all over the place too. But again, looking at that list, Canada is first, and Canada, again, is first by a lot. So let's go to the next slide. Canada is Maine's top trade partner, on both sides of the equation, imports and exports. Two-way trade between Maine and Canada tops $7.5 billion a year. Maine exports about 1.8 billion in goods to Canada every year. It fluctuates a little from year to year. There are also a lot of Canadian-owned businesses that are employing Maine workers. So it's not just trade where this relationship exists, but there is also an employment relationship that exists too. Next slide. So focusing in on trade a little bit more specifically. So 2024, the most recent year we just finished, trade with Canada accounted for 70% of all imports in Maine and 42% of all exports. So you can see there's some fluctuation over time. Imports from Canada have been going up a little bit in recent years. Exports to Canada have been going down a little bit. But in terms of our overall share, these are definitely the two biggest chunks. Next slide. So what are the things that we're trading back and forth with Canada? Well, so you can see on the left side, these are the exports. So these are the commodities that we are sending to Canada. First on the list, fish, fresh, chilled, frozen, and other marine products. Lobster falls into that category. It is the biggest piece of that category. There are some other things in there too, which is why it's sort of a larger description. Paper is right up there, transportation equipment, oil and gas, forestry products, and then a variety of other things. This is sort of the top 10 I think I pulled. It's a very, very long list that you can pull. If you look at the import side, so this is what we're getting from Canada, petroleum and coal products is top of that list. 80% of the gasoline, diesel, home heating oil burned in Maine comes from Canada. It's a really important source for Maine. I'll also point out we have an electricity tie too. There are a bunch of customers, close to 60,000 customers in northern and eastern Maine, that are tied exclusively to the New Brunswick electrical grid. But if you look down this list again, then you see paper, you see wood products, other things, food and kindred. There's fish again, fresh, chilled, frozen. So we are exporting things, but we are also importing the same things. And sometimes it is stuff that originated here is going over, something's being done and it's coming back. There's this back and forth that takes place, and sometimes it's stuff that's originating elsewhere that is coming here, and sometimes we do stuff to it and then send it back. So there is very much a fluid relationship on trade back and forth across the Canadian border. Next slide. So just to highlight some of these sort of key sectors that we tend to look at. So 2024, Canada received 94% of Maine's wood exports, 75% of its fish and crustacean exports. I just mentioned products can and do cross the border multiple times, so they can go back and forth. You can see how those three have sort of varied in terms of the share of the exports that are going to Canada for any particular one of those products. Paper and paperboard jumped up a bit in 2017, has come down a little bit more recently. Wood and articles of wood holding pretty steady, down just a little bit. It was close to 100% a while back. Fish, crustaceans, aquatic invertebrates running up a little bit the past couple of years after it had come down a little bit, but sort of in that 80% ballpark. Next slide. So I want to talk just briefly about sort of some other potential impacts that are related to trade and trade policies. The first thing that I wanted to mention is that uncertainty in trade policies, like tariffs, the things that are controlling how we send things back and forth across the border, that uncertainty contributes to an unsettled economic environment, and higher risk, particularly if we're talking about forecasting, and that tends to be negative risk. So if people are making decisions about the kinds of things that they're buying, or if they're a business and they're trying to decide where to invest or what to purchase as intermediate products for their business, not knowing what the policies are going to be contributes to this feeling of, I don't know what's going to happen. I'm going to be really cautious going forward. I'm maybe going to pull back. I'm maybe not going to spend as much. So that uncertainty can really harm the overall economy. The other thing that I wanted to talk about specifically related to Canada, the US-Canadian relations have been a bit tense lately, and that could impact the tourism sector and the retail sector. We get a lot of Canadian tourists and travelers who come down to the US and come down to Maine specifically. And there's been some consideration about the fact that some of those folks may decide not to come, or they may spend less. They may decide to either stay home, travel somewhere else instead of coming here. So there are some concerns related to impacts on the Maine economy from this other element of it's trade, but it's not sort of directly the trade piece of it. It's the feelings that come out of that trade piece. So I will leave it there and turn it back over to Nick. My contact information is there if people want to find more data or reach out to me after the fact.
Well, thank you, Amanda. Always a pleasure to hear you speak and talk about this work. And I have to say, I've been working on these issues with coastal Maine for my entire professional career, and it's always good to learn something new about how we're connected here on the coast and here in Maine to Canada, to other places. Very, very much appreciated. And I think that also helps provide an important context for why we're having this discussion now. And I suspect some of the themes that you brought up will continue throughout the rest of our conversation. And so we'll turn to Eric. And Eric, can you just help us understand a little bit about what are tariffs and how do they work with trade, and why why do they exist? What do like sort of help us understand all of this conversation that's happening? And there was a big announcement yesterday, so some announcements today. Yeah, thank you.
I suppose a lot of people are asking when they're looking at their new tariff rates, why do they exist? Is so let's go into the process. So a tariff fundamentally is a tax on imports. And so what that means is if you're importing a particular good for $100 and the tariff is 25%, then your total cost is going to be $125. And so the reason why countries have used tariffs historically is both for revenue purposes and industrial policy. So back in the 100 years ago, well, really 120 years ago, the US government funded most of its revenue through customs duties, through tariffs. But with the introduction of the income tax and with greater global interconnection, the importance of tariffs in the revenue picture of the United States declined significantly. And the second reason for tariffs is industrial policy. And so if I want to encourage certain types of production in my country and discourage imports coming into the country, then I might put a tariff in there because that changes the overall cost that consumers, whether they're industrial goods buyers or end consumers, pay for the particular product. So it's an idea of incentivizing people to buy domestic and to not buy imported. And so one of the things when you look at President Trump and his agenda, the central animating force of his life has been tariffs. Going back to the 1980s, he has made very clear that he believes that tariffs are important for the United States, that it builds a strong economy in the United States. And when he set out on this long journey to become president and then become president again, tariffs were really at the heart of his agenda. But what we saw yesterday with the introduction of so-called reciprocal tariffs on every country in the world, except Canada and Mexico, which I'll deal with on a separate track, is really an overturning of the way that international commerce has worked for the last 40 years. And so it is a dramatic, profound reshaping of commerce, particularly for US companies, Maine companies, going from a low tariff environment internationally to a high tariff environment internationally. So President Trump during the first term did put some tariffs in place. They tended to focus on things like steel and aluminum products and things that were more linked to heavy industry, which he believes are fundamental to the economy of the United States. Those tariffs, particularly those on China, were maintained by the Biden administration. But what we've seen since he returned to power is a whole series of tariffs that are just vastly larger and more far-reaching than what we saw in the last term. And so 25th of November, he put out a post on Truth Social that said, I'll put a 25% tariff on Canada and Mexico. There were a series of policy announcements. We got to February 1st when ultimately he announced those tariffs were going into effect. Canada said that it would retaliate with $155 billion in tariffs of its own on US products going north. Luckily for the lobster industry, it was not included in the first tranche because the way that Canada structured its retaliation was 30 billion up front and then the remaining 125 billion, and these are in Canadian dollars. So if you do kind of 0.7 to 1, then the Canadian dollar is less strong and than the US dollar. So lobsters were not included in that first list. Good news for the Maine lobster industry, given its strong level of integration, which Luke will go into. But those tariffs were then postponed by President Trump for a month in March. And in March, what they did was he said, if you are using the US, Canada, Mexico trade agreement, which is the new NAFTA. So in President Trump's first term, he took the North American Free Trade Agreement, which many folks will have heard about, and turned that into a new agreement called the US, Canada, Mexico agreement with important changes. But from the tariff perspective, there was duty-free treatment, or treat your trade without tariffs across the borders of Canada, the US, and Mexico. And the arrangement that was reached really by President Trump and has been echoed in many respects by Canada is that if the goods that cross the border are what is called claiming preference under the agreement, so it says, when I show up at the border, I'm going to use the rules of that particular agreement and I'm going to be categorized as an export by that agreement, then I can get in without tariffs. But we've seen over the course of March that President Trump took a number of other steps, which include putting a 25% tariff on automobiles and auto parts, and also on steel and aluminum. Now, these are not big industries in Maine, but why they're important is because they're massive industries for the US and Canada, and they invite retaliation. And if you look, for example, at the context of trade with China, China got a 10% tariff by President Trump in February, then another 10% in March. And that sat on top of the 20% average tariff they had from the Trump administration, which of course was different for different products. And then yesterday in the reciprocal tariff announcement, they got another 34%. So your kind of baseline for China scenario is now 54%. But when that tranche of the first tranche of 10% went in, China put in a retaliatory 10% tariff on US lobster exports to its country. At the same time, China also put in a 25% tariff on Canadian lobster exports because back in the summer, Canada, in collaboration with the then Biden administration, put in place a 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles and other sorts of goods. So even though you're thinking, well, my only relation to the auto industry is I buy an F-150 and I drive it. Well, these things have spillover effects in other parts of the economy because the way countries that are looking to put pressure on the US, for example, tend to approach things is they will take a look at the map politically to say, well, this senator may be influential, so we're going to go after something in that particular state. And so when Mitch McConnell was the Senate Majority Leader for years from Kentucky, people would put the tariffs on Kentucky bourbon because that's a big industry in Kentucky. And that was a way of sending a message to the leader. And so there's been an awful lot of action on this particular front. The important thing for the Maine lobster industry is right now, if you use the US, Canada, Mexico agreement, you are not facing tariffs. But that doesn't mean that we are out of the woods or that we are not going to see tariffs in the future. President Trump has shown himself willing to change course, put different policies in place. And so this will be something that's important. And for those markets where there are tariffs, it will become very important to look at the supply chain, what processes one can use in order to get around these tariffs or at least mitigate them, because there are buried within US customs law a number of technical strategies which many companies are looking at. But lobster is a supply chain, just like many other products. And this is something that perhaps the average person with a lobster on their plate is not thinking about. But I'll hand it over to Luke, and he will tell you all about the realities of the lobster supply chain and how tariffs could come into this.
Awesome. Thank you, Eric. One quick point of clarification. So just want to make sure that we're understanding when we say tariffs on various goods, there's a very long, detailed, specific list that goes along with that, and it might be different on different things depending on the context.
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah.
So every product in the world has a harmonized system code. So there's this international nomenclature, basically way that things are classified. And broadly speaking, they start with live animals and end with heavily processed goods. And so everything has a code. And when these sorts of tariffs announcements are made, you will often see technical annexes to say, here are the list of 225 codes that will get this. And so in the potash, or sorry, in the Canada tariffs that were announced by President Trump and then deferred, potash was given a 10% tariff because potash is important for anyone who's growing crops in the agricultural business. And so, but other products, consumer goods, industrial products got 25%. So people set the levels based on also what the needs are of their economy, because as the man just said, everybody doesn't make everything, and you may need certain types of products in order to grow your economy.
Thank you. Very helpful. Wanted to make sure that we got to that. Luke, turning to you, in Maine, we tend to think about our lobstermen and then maybe having a lobster roll down on the dock or at a restaurant down in Portland. Can you talk to us a little bit about sort of Luke's Lobster, how you guys work with the lobster industry and Canada's influence on the industry, and then maybe a little bit more broadly on how the lobster industry works together between Maine and Canada around processing and trade?
Absolutely. For the 248 people who are choosing to spend their time to learn about this and listen to us, thank you very much. I think I'm here today mostly because of I spend all my time working and living in the lobster industry. The reality is that my dad was the very first licensed lobster processor here in the state of Maine. So I grew up in this industry, and I now choose to work and live in this industry. At Luke's today, we buy a lot of live lobster coming out of Canada in May and June when that season is open and giving an abundance of supply. We buy a lot of finished products out of Canada. So lobster meat, cooked lobster meat, lobster tails, mince, lobster leg meat, a lot of lobster products that we use for some of our value-added products. And then here in the state of Maine, we own and manage wharfs, as well as partner with co-ops where we buy live lobster, crab, and we run it through our production facility in Saco, Maine. So we have a 60,000 square foot state-of-the-art seafood production facility that depends on live supply of lobster coming out of Canada May and June, and out of Maine mostly July through December. So the lobster industry itself is completely commingled. We in the state, using kind of round numbers, we harvest about 90 million pounds of lobsters a year. And I would bet that almost half of that gets processed up in Canada. And I would bet at least 75% of what gets processed in Canada comes back in the US, where the majority of the market is. So given the seasonality of when the countries harvest lobster and balancing the capacity of these state-of-the-art production facilities, whether they're in Maine or Canada, free trade is critically important to keep the supply of lobsters matched with the demand. At Luke's, the way that we ultimately make money is through an omni-channel approach. So we have close to 30 restaurants across 14 different states where we are selling the Maine way. We are our star of the show is a Maine style lobster roll, and we're trying to sell that Maine style lobster roll through Maine hospitality. The second biggest is grocery for us. So we supply a lot of lobster meat and lobster tails to grocery stores across the country. And then part of that is a big consumer packaged good business that we have. And in getting a lot of those value added process products out of Canada is a big part of our supply chain. So thinking again of like lobster mince and lobster leg meat, and using those as key ingredients as you make lobster ravioli, lobster mac and cheese, and items like that. We ultimately have been we've been in this business for a long time, and free trade with our Canadian partners is critical. I will add though that there is an element of it's been tough to be a Maine processor for a long time now. There's been a fair amount of competitive advantages that play well up in Canada that don't exist in the state. And so while we're in a world right now where we're definitely seeing like a very dynamic stage where things are constantly changing, there was a subset of the industry that might have benefited from some type of tariff in place. So it is it is something that we're paying a ton of attention to. And ultimately, like, what we have to pay the most attention to is what the consumer is willing to do, and that's critically important, because at the end of the day, lobster is it's an indulgence, it's a luxury item, and people are only willing to pay for something like that when they've got confidence in the economy. And I think that a lot of this uncertainty is driving a lack of consumer confidence, which ultimately could impact the lobster industry as well.
Yeah, a little follow up to that. You know, I think you often hear in working with the industry that the people buying the lobsters are setting the price, or are you know, they're the ones who are making all the money in this, and the harvesters aren't making money. Can you talk a little bit about the pricing dynamics in the industry and what that consumer confidence means for what lobstermen might get paid, and also maybe a little bit about the matching of supply and demand, sort of some of it, like what goes into the boat price versus what goes into uh, the price for the lobster roll um, in a restaurant or something.
Yeah, it's a super challenging question to ask, because there's so much supply and demand factors that go into play, and there's demand often for the live market, which might drive price if supply is low, and then there's demand in the processor market depending on different times of year, and then that demand is ultimately always driven by what the customer is willing to pay. So what is the customer at Whole Foods willing to pay for a lobster tail? What's the customer in Chicago willing to pay for a lobster roll? And and that's where consumer confidence plays a huge role, because that customer doesn't need to buy a lobster tail at the seafood counter. They don't need to buy a lobster roll for lunch in Chicago. And so as confidence ultimately becomes more shaky, that's where we have to like really pay attention to how that ultimately could affect the value of the total harvest across both borders.
It's complicated stuff. All right. So for the audience, those listening, if you have questions, drop them in the chat. Um, we'll try to get them answered as best we can. Eric, just sort of going back to what happened yesterday, just making sure that we're all clear. No tariffs on lobster for US Canada, lobster tariffs. broad tariffs on lots of goods for lots of countries.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So President Trump announced that he called this Liberation Day was his phrasing, and said that this was going to be the big announcement, and indeed it was a big announcement. So what happened yesterday was, for every country in the world except Canada and Mexico, which are on a different track, there was a 10% baseline tariff put into effect. So that means that everybody everybody in the world on all the goods they're selling to the United States has to pay that 10% tariff. But for other countries where the tariff rates were higher, they had added rate on top of that. So, for example, if you were in Japan, your rate was 24%. And so that was based on a calculation that looked at what the US trade deficit was, how much the US sold to the country, how much the country sold to the United States. And they came up with an overall number, and then President Trump put a discounted rate, often somewhere in the range of 50% on those particular countries. So the European Union got 20%, Israel 17%, and then China got 34%, South Korea 26%, Vietnam very, very high at 46% because of all of the manufactured goods exports to the US. So what this means is that countries, when they're selling their goods to the United States, will have to pay these tariffs when they show up at the border. Now, typically what happens is that when countries are hit with tariffs, they tend to retaliate. So the European Union has already retaliated on US tariffs on steel and aluminum. They are working on their tariffs in response to today's announcement. And so you will see a whole series of countries retaliating. Now, specifically on the case of Canada and Mexico, as I mentioned, the state of play as it was left in early March, and as it was reaffirmed yesterday, is that if you are using the USMCA rules, so if you show up at the border and say, I am declaring that this is originating product of Canada that is entering the United States, and I'm doing that under USMCA rules, I don't pay a tariff. But the US has put tariffs on automobiles and other things, which are causing Canada to retaliate. So far, no spillover on the lobster industry. But if you are trying to export from the United States to Europe, you should expect that the industry will face significant tariff cost going into the European Union as part of the retaliation. And then President Trump has talked about retaliating on the retaliation. So it's hard to say where this ultimately ends. I think the one thing we can say for pretty certain is that these tariffs are likely going to be in place for a long time to come, and that the old world of low cost trade and low cost shipping, where you saw vast quantities of supply chains shift to Asia and goods being made in distant jurisdictions and coming to the United States, that world is going away, and we're moving back to a world of higher tariffs. And that means more localized production, but it also means higher costs for consumers on most everything they buy, which will have ramifications for relative luxury goods like lobster in terms of their consumption allocation choices.
I'm glad you brought up that last part. So thinking about if Luke is, and maybe Luke can help answer this, but if you're shipping a container of processed lobster to a country with a tariff, who pays that, and then where does that land on the price of the product? Is that something that the company just takes and eats? Does it impact the end market price? Just have a little bit more on that so people can understand some of these dynamics at play here.
Yeah, so in the hypothetical that there was a tariff on lobster coming from Canada to Maine, like what that would look like is if we bought $100 of lobster out of Canada in Maine, and it was a 10% tariff, we would pay $110 for that lobster. And in that scenario, it would be, if you have a 10% margin that you typically try and maintain, would you mark that $110 up 10%? Or would you eat that 10% increase? Or would you go back to your supplier and push that $100 down? And I think that's what we're all going to have to figure out. I think that what this gets back to, though, and what you can't ignore, is that like all of this uncertainty again has shaken customer confidence. So like the ability to just pass cost on to a customer that already thought the world was too expensive before this happened, and then now is ultimately a little bit more timid and cautious with how they're spending, it doesn't create a ripe environment to just pass cost on. And I think that that's like that's something that we've got to be super aware of in any type of discretionary spending, because everything that's non-discretionary has the potential to go up too in the short term.
Yeah, Nick, one thing I would say is that if you did end up with a situation where there were a tariff between the US and Canada, and if the current status quo were not to hold, there are a number of elements embedded within the various tariffs that the US have put in place that companies could use, where essentially if they are doing processing abroad and bringing those goods back into the United States, that if they were part of the program and it was all properly documented, that they would only have to pay the tariff on the part of the good that was added abroad. So the so-called value added part that was done abroad. And the idea is to not have US companies pay tariffs on US goods that went abroad. So if you sent it abroad and the value was $100, it came back, the value was $120, you'd pay on the $20 as opposed to on the $120. But, there's paperwork and things that have to be done in order to get your supply chain structured here. So, the bottom line is no matter what happens, people are going to be spending a lot more time doing compliance paperwork and showing where their goods came from.
Great, thank you. Amanda, thinking a little bit about Maine, we have this close relationship with Canada. We have families, people in Maine sometimes have families in Canada. We have this cross-border trade. We have this close relationship. How does Maine as a state work with Canada on these issues, recognizing that, or is Maine working with Canada on these issues, recognizing that it's driven predominantly by federal concerns?
Right. I mean, I think the good news is that as much as possible, we are Canada knows that Maine, particularly the parts of Canada that are closest to Maine, we've always had a strong relationship. Canada recognizes that the things that are happening federally are in large part out of the hands of Maine and not something that we have much control, if any control, over. So at least thus far, the relationship has been less strained between Maine and Canada than between sort of the US and Canada. That still, there are still challenges. I talked about Canadian tourism. Canada says, yes, Maine, we have a close relationship, but also we're kind of mad at the US. And so we're going to encourage people not to go there, not because we don't like you, Maine, but because you happen to be part of the US. So, there are certainly some parts of it that are a little more troubled at the moment, but we still are maintaining a good relationship, and certainly, the governor and the premiers of the provinces nearby have a very good relationship and work closely as much as possible on the issues that are controllable at a more state level.
Yeah, and Nick, one of the things, for example, that Alaska just did was their state legislature passed a resolution reaffirming the importance of the relationship with Canada and affirming Canada's sovereignty, because a lot of the basis of concern has been about sovereignty issues and President Trump's rhetoric around Canada being the 51st state. So there are some state legislatures, for example, that are taking action to send a signal to people across the border that we still want to have a good, strong, constructive relationship. And that's one way where neighbors can feel reassured that their neighbors are not looking at them in a different way.
Yeah. Luke, you're
Yeah, if it's okay. I mean, I made a pretty vague statement earlier that sparked a bunch of questions in the comments, and so I feel like if it's all right, Nick, I'd love to just circle back to it. So what I said earlier is that there was a segment of the lobster industry that was kind of looking forward to potentially some tariffs and rebalancing scales. And what I meant by that was, for a long time, if you compare a Maine lobster processor relative to a Canadian lobster processor, the scales have not been they've not been equal. Generally speaking, up in Canada, workforce development, workforce eligibility is always a big part in running these production facilities. And Canada has been more friendly and supportive of getting foreign workers to come in and run those facilities. That's one huge difference. A second huge difference is that, generally speaking, the communities up there support those processors in a much more significant way. So a lot of the really expensive capital expenditures that go into modernizing and keeping up these production facilities get subsidized by taxes and local communities up there, because they're such big employers and such big parts of the community. We don't get that in the state of Maine. And then, just like another very basic example is when you think about the exchange rate. If in the US we pay a teammate $20 an hour to work in the plants, and up in Canada somebody pays their teammate $20 an hour, that $20 gets baked into the cost of the production of the product. But when you think about producing it in Canada and then selling it back into the US, you pick up that arbitrage. So that's really that last one is an example of how the exchange rate has not worked in our favor for a very long time. The other two have been longer stem issues. And so how that's played out negatively is that we've seen less and less production capacity in Maine and New England over the last 10 years. There's been more plants that have closed or reduced their volume than the opposite here in the state. And where that's not good over time is that we need to make sure that we've got capacity on this side of the border, and that we've got production capability to produce similar quality products here. And so if we don't have a equal playing field, you won't see that type of investment on this side of the border. You'll continue to see those types of businesses yield and ultimately not invest capital in that space. And that has a negative impact will have a negative impact eventually on the lobster industry, because there'll just be less competition for the product and less competition for the product inside the state. Hopefully that clears that vague comment I made earlier, and I apologize for the vagueness of it.
Yeah, and I think it's just worth saying that when it comes to processing lobster, it's a high volume, low margin industry. I remember a tour I did one day of one of those lobster processors that's gone out of business, and they were saying their profit margin was pretty much in the leg meat that they were able to squeeze out, and makes it hard if you're adding other changes to it. Cool. So we are getting close to wrapping up. If you have any final burning questions, we can try to maybe get one or two more in here before we wrap. And as maybe people are typing one more just for the group. you know, we've been talking about lobsters today, but the lobster industry is broader than just the lobsters themselves that go back and forth and get processed. Um, any thoughts or perspectives on the industry and impacts on steel tariffs or other things that the industry should be thinking that are broader than the lobsters themselves? And you know, Luke, you mentioned workforce and immigration and um, some of the other issues swirling around related to the lobster industry.
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to energy. When Amanda put that chart up and you see how much energy we import from Canada, you know, there'll be something to consider there. You think about paperboard, whether you're shipping live lobsters or finished goods, it's all got to go into paperboard. So it's like you got to think about all the materials that go into the cost of goods, and that's just one side of it. Again, I keep saying this, but like the consumer's confidence and what they're willing to spend, you just can't ignore that, and that's what we got to be super careful around, and where costing and pricing will ultimately kind of dictate what things are worth.
I think that uncertainty around what is happening in the economy is a point that I just cannot stress enough. The Maine's Consensus Economic Forecasting Commission met on Monday this week to update their economic forecast. And that was definitely the big takeaway, is like giant flashing red lights, uncertainty. We just don't know. And so that meant they did make some relatively minor downward revisions to their forecast in a couple of lines, but a lot of it was actually they didn't make changes because there's so much uncertainty that it's hard to even know what to do. And so without having sort of compelling evidence that something is going to change one way or another, you're left sort of, okay, well, we're just going to stay where we are. And then if something changes down the line, then we can make adjustments. But that uncertainty is definitely flowing through all different aspects of the economy right now.
Yeah, I would say there's a couple of things that stand out. So one of the things I'm going to have tonight is lobster pate. So it's a product that people didn't really think about back in the day, but there are different types of lobster products that can be developed and deployed. And then there's the whole question of markets. When you see that US lobster exports into China and Canadian lobster exports into China are both facing significant tariffs, China will undoubtedly be shifting to other varietals of seafood, or perhaps other varietals of, say, tropical lobster species. And so there'll be a need to look at what are new markets that can be developed that will pick up some of that slack. Because if we assume that US tariffs will stay in place for a while and that the China-Canada relationship remains in a very bad position, that market is going to be very, very difficult to serve. I mean, there's a few things that one can try. And if you were able to get to a point where tariffs on Canada were able to be lifted, you could ship some Maine lobster to Canada, do processing, and send it to China. But fundamentally, I think both countries are going to be facing tariffs in China, which means that a lot of that volume that had gone to the Asian export market is going to need to find new homes. And that's going to take a lot of work and partnerships, not only with the industry on the ground in Maine, but with federal partners, commercial service, foreign agricultural service, people abroad. And so diversity of products, diversity of markets, but of course that's expensive. It takes time. And, fundamentally, you don't know what's going to work. Who likes lobster pate? Maybe I do, but maybe people in India don't. So see where it goes.
I do think it's worth, like Eric, kind of building on that, is just that it's a relatively small resource. It's a relatively small protein. It's made up of stakeholders that are incredibly resilient, from processors up to fishermen. Like everybody has figured it out in the past, and like this challenge relative to COVID or some of the whale challenges in recent past are I do sort of think pale in comparison. So like we will catch the product, we will produce it, we will sell it. It's just all the noise around it that will be a distraction and stuff we have to work for. When you think about just to like bring light to, you know, another perspective of what Amanda's saying, when you think about like a 40% tariff on garments coming from Vietnam back into the US, that means like, you know, somebody's t-shirt or coat or shoes or is you got to go back to that equation of like, do you push the supplier down? Do you pass the cost on? Does the business, like that chaos is going to somehow manifest in a lack of confidence in the customer. And like I think that's like the biggest risk in this for us is just how does that intersection affect our consumer? But again, like we have a delicious product, and it's incredibly resilient industry, and we've worked through harder hurdles in the past, in my opinion.
Yeah, that is a good moment, I think, to end this on. One of Island Institute's values is hopeful persistence, which I think, Luke, you were just speaking to in a lot of ways, that we will catch the lobsters, we will process them, people will eat them. It's a delicious product. Despite all of the uncertainty, despite all of the um, maybe confusion or wondering what's happening next or where things are going, we do have a strong coast, and it's the people that make our coast strong, and our communities and our connections to each other. And so, uh, on that note, we will say thank you to our panelists. Very much appreciate you joining today. I know I learned a ton about tariffs and trade at Maine and how it all the pieces come together to impact the lobster industry as we think about how this industry navigates the future, navigates tariffs in the coming years if those happen, navigates a variety of issues. It's really helpful to have this baseline context and understanding of some of the concepts, and hopefully those of you watching the webinar are able to walk away with a better understanding of what tariffs might mean for the lobster industry, and what or might not mean for the lobster industry, and how the industry could be thinking about approaching some of these conversations. So um, thank you very much. The webinar was recorded. We'll be sending it out to all of you who attended, or all of you who registered, and you'll also be getting a survey. So again, just a big thank you to our panelists, Eric, Luke, Amanda. Appreciate your taking the time to join us today.
Thank you.